Hey, it's Drybear. Another week has come and went, so it's time to check in on the tanks in Dragonflight. We'll rank all tank specializations stacked up next to each other in Heroic Raid, Mythic Raid, and Mythic Plus to see which ones came out ahead in week 9. As always, if you have any questions or comments for me, you can find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come by and hang out. We'll kick things off like we always do by looking at last week's numbers. So on screen, you'll see where the tanks stacked up in week 8 of Dragonflight Season 1, and then we'll take a look at Dragonflight Season 1, week 9. We saw some pretty big changes coming in for Brewmaster, and then some nerfs for Protection Warrior, some buffs for Guardian and Protection Paladin that went live after these numbers were pulled. So we'll see if Guardian and Protection Paladin rose as a result of those buffs. And here we are with week 9's numbers. Specifically, I think that we're actually in a spot now where most tanks are pretty much relatively close together. I think the buffs to Guardian were quite effective. Brewmaster's in a much better spot than it was before. The major change that we got to Blood DK last week was the increase to their damage output. They've always had great healing, and then they've had a decent toolkit, but their damage was not as good as others, and it actually was affecting their Mythic Plus performance, where they weren't being brought to higher keys, because you need everyone, tank and healer included, in order to be doing damage in the Mythic Plus in order to clear keys above 20. Everyone needs to be doing damage. You need to kill things quickly. So if a tank is doing less damage than others, then they won't be brought as much as others. So let's look at the numbers here. This is actually more of a shakeup than I thought would happen. Let's talk about it. On the very top, if you stack all 3 categories together for tank, Blood DK came out ahead this week. Now, a caveat on this, I would say tank is probably the hardest role to rank out of all 3 of the roles we have in the game, just because there isn't really a clear metric that does it. This is just looking at score for Mythic Plus, and then speed and execution on Raid, which just kind of shows what tanks are doing the best. But as long as they don't die and they have decent healing and decent damage reduction, and they do their tank mechanics properly, any tank works. And we're actually at a point now that I would say the tanks are more balanced than DPS and heals right now. They're all actually in a pretty decent spot. You could argue that maybe Guardian still needs a little bit more love. Vengeance might need some more flat tankiness updates, and maybe some cooldown adjustments for Brewmaster, but across the board, I think we're actually in a pretty decent spot. For the first time in possibly all 9 weeks of Dragonflight Season 1, Protection Warrior is not in the first spot. Now, they did get a nerf, so it did affect them directly, and then we saw buffs for Blood DK and Protection Paladin and Guardian Druid, and we saw several buffs in a row for Brewmaster over the last month or so. But Blood DK did come out on top this week. They did 3rd overall in Heroic Raid, and they did 4th overall in Mythic Plus. But as is the trend that we're seeing now, I think once we get this far into a tier, people just kind of bring their alts to Mythic clearing. And we're actually just seeing some crazy trends develop in Mythic Raid, which kind of makes these videos fun, at least for me and hopefully for you, to see what people are testing out. It's like, okay, I got my Protection Warrior geared out. I got my Windwalker geared out. Let's try my ult and see how much I can push them and put full support behind them. And in Mythic Raid, Blood DK did amazing this week. I think a lot of people, if they're on Mythic Raid farm, they probably brought their Blood DKs and their Guardian Druids this week just to see, how they performed after the buffs, and maybe kind of benched their Protection Warriors that were probably already geared out. And that's kind of what we're seeing here for Mythic Raid. And that difference in Mythic Raid was enough to put Blood DK in first, but it's very, very close. Overall, I'd say Blood DK, Prot Paladin, Prot Warrior, and Vengeance DH did amazingly well this week. And part of that's just from the Heroic Raid score for Vengeance and Protection Paladin. In second slot is Protection Paladin. They did get some damage increase, which affects threat as well, helps them on initial pulls. There's a couple pulls in Vault of the Incarnates, like Dathia when you go into a platform and you have to get aggro really quickly, and several periods when you land in like intermissions and stuff like that, or Razageth, and then there's a couple other fights and scenarios where that matters a lot. But Protection Paladin getting that buff it had a major impact. They've been creeping up. Actually, all throughout the season, Protection Paladin started as one of the weakest. And I remember when we were first doing predictions on where the classes were going to end up, I remember Protection Paladin was actually in the bottom 2, like the last 1 or 2 slots for ranking. And they started the season quite weak. They were actually squishy. A lot of people were complaining that they couldn't take a hit and they were dying a lot. Their damage was low. Their threat generation was low. And I swear to God, they've been just chipping away at it every week, climbing. Over the last month or so, since the buffs that we saw in December, Protection Paladin has been doing much better in Mythic Plus. They've been rivaling Protection Warrior and Blood DK for Mythic Plus. And finally, this week, they actually outperformed Protection Warrior in Mythic Plus. They took the top spot in Heroic Raid and in Mythic Plus. Now, maybe that's just because once they're super geared and they can scale off their Shield of the Righteous and they can keep themselves tanky and they can actually survive in between their big cooldowns, they're actually insanely self-sufficient. They have tons of self-healing if they want it. They can even off-heal in some situations with some clutch Word of Glories. They can pop their Ardent, whatever the resolve is that allows them to cast 3 Word of Glories in a row for free. They can off-heal, they can spot heal, they can heal themselves, they can tank. They have tons of really cool absorbs. They can use their Divine's Shield in some tank situations. If they're running the talent, it allows them to taunt when they have it. And they're killing it in Mythic Plus. They didn't do super great in Mythic Raid. In fact, it didn't look like they were brought too much at all in Mythic Raid relative to the new Blood or Guardian changes and then Protection Warrior Brewmaster. So I would say, when they are just being looked at for a stand-in, a tank role in the highest group content, like 20-man Mythic Raid content, they aren't performing as well as the other tanks. But in Mythic Plus, they're doing amazing and they're doing perfect, like just great in Heroic Raid, which tells me that, if you're someone who does 20 keys and below and you do Heroic Raids, Protection Paladin actually did the best this week overall. Underneath Protection Paladin is Protection Warrior. For the first time ever, they're not in the first 2 slots. And really, they're not in the first slot. Part of that is the nerfs that they got. I was kind of shocked to see that they decided to nerf Warrior relative to others, but that's where we're at with that. And I think they also have a higher skill floor than some of the other tanks because you do have to manage Rage better. It's not like Guardian where you can just kind of spam Iron Fur, and so you have a lot more buttons to press and things to manage to get things just right, and you have to plan ahead of time like Brewmaster does, as well as having other buttons on top of it. So yeah, I think Protection Warrior did about average in all content except for Mythic Plus this week, and take that for what you will. Vengeance Demon Hunter probably had one of the best weeks it's had in a while, primarily from Heroic Raid. They did kind of poorly in Mythic Raid and Mythic Plus, but you can see that they, when they're stacking healing and skipping mechanics and trying to solo tank things and get multiple stacks on stuff, they do okay. They just definitely haven't been scaling as much. And I would argue that their Heroic Raid scoring this week is saving them from having a much lower performance overall in the other 2 categories. Brewmaster fell a little bit this week, but if you look at the actual numbers, it's not too, they're not too far off from the median. They're doing about the same as Protection Warrior in Mythic Raid this week. They're doing in the top 3 for Mythic Plus. So I'd say Brewmaster still doing amazingly well. But then, if they're just tanking normally, maybe, in Heroic Raid, the lower number is there. And I think the most encouraging aspect here is that Guardian has come up. I wouldn't say there's too much of a deviation between the bottom tanks here. It looks like the changes that Guardian got helped them clear the gap a little bit. They do still underperform in Mythic Plus, but honestly, these numbers are so close together in Heroic Raid, and they're in the top 2 for Mythic Raid this week that they're doing much better. I would say they just need possibly something that could help them in a Mythic Plus setting without affecting their raid performance. But again, I don't know about you, but I'm actually pretty pleased with this. I think that the tanks are in a relatively good spot, all things considered. I think they perform pretty well. They all have decent tankiness, and the buffs that Guardian got, Brewmaster got, Blood DK got helped them quite a lot. I don't know if Protection Warrior needed the nerfs when everyone else was getting buffs at the same time, but here's where we are for Week 9 tanks. Let me know what you think down below. If anything shocked you or surprised you, or if you're seeing a trend that I'm not mentioning here, let me know as well. And as always, if you have any questions or comments for me, you'll find me live every day on twitch.tv/Drybear. Come by and say hi. If you enjoyed yourself today, leave a like down below. You can support me and my work on Patreon and view Patreon exclusive content, link in the description. Thank you so much for tuning in, and I'll see you in the next one.